They called it the Fritz Ritz. In the scorching heat of the Texas plains, thousands of captured German soldiers found themselves behind barbed wire fences, but in conditions so comfortable that many would later describe their time as prisoners of war in America as the best years of our lives. As Wehrmacht soldier Karl-Heinz Hackbarth wrote in his diary on July 4, 1943, upon arriving at Camp Hearne, Texas, we expected a harsh desert prison, perhaps even torture. Instead, we found swimming pools, orchestras, and food better than what our comrades at the front are eating. It feels wrong to be treated this well by our enemies. Before we dive into this extraordinary story, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching from? It's incredible to see our historical community spread across the world. And if you're new here, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Each subscription helps us continue unearthing these fascinating stories that shaped our world. Now, let's get to the story. The American POW system that would eventually hold over 425,000 enemy prisoners during World War II began as little more than a concept on paper. When the first substantial numbers of German and Italian prisoners began arriving on American shores in 1942, the United States military found itself in an unprecedented situation. The country had minimal experience housing enemy combatants on American soil, with the last significant prisoner population dating back to the Civil War. Yet, within months, the U.S. would construct one of the most sophisticated and humane prisoner-of-war systems in modern warfare, one that would leave its captives bewildered by their treatment. The Texas POW story is uniquely revealing of America's complex wartime character, simultaneously capable of fierce combat against Axis forces abroad while maintaining an almost stubborn adherence to humanitarian principles at home. In the words of Lieutenant Colonel Alphonse Cleforth, who helped design the American POW program, how we treat our enemies reflects more on us than it does on them. This philosophy would be put to the test across the Texas plains, where former Nazi soldiers found themselves living in conditions that many Americans themselves couldn't access during wartime rationing. The first prisoner transports arrived under cover of darkness. Military officials feared public reaction to housing the enemy in their communities, particularly after news of American casualties in North Africa and the Pacific began reaching home. Railway cars with blacked-out windows carried the initial waves of captured Afrika Korps soldiers, men who had fought under Rommel and now found themselves transported from the scorching deserts of North Africa to the equally baking plains of Texas. The initial processing centers at Fort Bliss, Camp Swift, and Camp Hearne became their first introduction to American captivity. When they removed our blindfolds at the train station, remembered Otto Binder, a captured lieutenant from the 15th Panzer Division. I expected to see guards with whips or worse. We had been told Americans tortured prisoners. Instead, there were medical officers offering us cigarettes and hot coffee. I thought it must be some elaborate propaganda trick. It wasn't. The coffee and cigarettes were just the beginning of what would become known among the prisoners as the American Miracle. The Geneva Convention of 1929 established clear protocols for prisoner treatment, including housing equivalent to that of the capturing nation's own troops, proper medical care, and adequate food. But what stunned the Axis prisoners was America's meticulous, almost excessive, adherence to these rules. Where the convention mandated minimum standards, the Americans often exceeded them. This wasn't merely idealism. It was strategic. As Major General Archer Lurch, the U.S. Provost Marshal General who oversaw the POW program, explained in a confidential 1943 memo, "Our compliance creates leverage for the proper treatment of our own men in enemy hands. Every meal we serve, every medical treatment we provide, is an investment in the welfare of American prisoners overseas." Camp construction followed standardized plans developed by the Army Corps of Engineers. The typical Texas POW camp consisted of wooden barracks arranged in company-sized units housing 250 men each. Each camp contained multiple compounds, often segregating prisoners by rank, nationality, or political inclination. Communal latrines, mess halls, recreation fields, theaters, canteens, and infirmaries completed the facilities. The camps were designed to be self-contained communities, with the key difference being the 10-foot barbed wire fences and guard towers that encircled them. Hauptmann Captain Friedrich von Müller of the Wehrmacht's 164th Infantry Division recorded his first impressions of Camp Swift in a letter later confiscated by camp censors. The barracks are clean, well-ventilated, and surprisingly comfortable. We have real beds with springs, not the straw pallets we expected. There is hot water for showers each day, and the toilets flush. I have not enjoyed such comforts since before the war began. Our own army would never provide common soldiers with such accommodations. The food served to prisoners became legendary among the captives. Under Geneva provisions, POWs were entitled to rations equal to those of American garrison troops, a standard that meant the German and Italian prisoners often ate better in captivity than they had in their own military. The daily caloric intake for prisoners averaged between 3,000 and 3,500 calories, a feast by wartime European standards. While American civilians faced rationing of meat, sugar, and butter, POWs received these items as part of their guaranteed rations, creating occasional resentment in nearby communities. A typical daily menu at Camp Hearn in 1943 included eggs and bacon for breakfast, with coffee and toast, a lunch of beef stew, vegetables, and fruit, and a dinner featuring roast chicken, potatoes, and cake for dessert. By comparison, German soldiers on the Eastern Front were surviving on 1,500 calories daily, often consisting primarily of bread and thin soup. As one prisoner, Hans Geller, wrote home, "Please do not send food packages. We eat better here than you can at home. Save the food for yourselves and the children." Perhaps most surprising to the prisoners was the establishment of camp canteens where they could purchase additional luxuries. Each prisoner received coupons or credits for labor performed, redeemable for items including cigarettes, beer with reduced alcohol content, candy, toiletries, and even art supplies. The canteens operated as small stores within the camp perimeter, offering a taste of normal life behind barbed wire. Some camps even permitted special orders for items not regularly stocked. I could not believe it when I first saw chocolate bars for sale, remembered Italian prisoner Guido Farina, captured in Sicily. In Italy, even before the war, such things were rare luxuries. Here in prison, I could buy them with money earned from working in the camp kitchen. It seemed like some strange dream. Work became a central element of the POW experience in Texas. Initially, many prisoners refused labor assignments, believing that military honor prevented them from aiding their enemy's war effort. However, the Geneva Convention permitted employing prisoners in non-war-related work, and the desperate labor shortage in America's agricultural sector created mutual benefit. Prisoners could earn 80 cents per day, approximately $13 in today's currency, for agricultural labor, logging, or camp maintenance. Funds credited to their canteen accounts. The War Department carefully monitored this work program to ensure compliance with international law. POWs could not be employed in dangerous conditions, could not directly support war production, and could not work in areas that might expose them to public hostility. These restrictions meant that agricultural labor became the primary employment for Texas POWs, with thousands working in cotton fields, citrus groves, and rice farms across the state. For many German prisoners, this agricultural work proved revelatory. "I had never seen farms of such scale," wrote Hans Weber, a former mechanic from Berlin. "The machines, the vastness of the fields. It made our German farms seem like small gardens in comparison. I began to understand why America could afford to be so generous with food. They have more land than they know what to do with." The labor program produced another unexpected consequence: cultural exchange. Working alongside American farmers, Mexican braceros, and in some cases African-American laborers, the German and Italian prisoners received an unfiltered view of American society that contradicted Nazi propaganda. Though fraternization was officially discouraged, the long hours in the fields inevitably led to conversations, shared meals, and occasionally friendships. Farmer Jesse Williams from Navasota, Texas, who employed POWs from nearby Camp Hearn, later recalled, "Those boys weren't so different from our own. Young fellows who'd rather be home than fighting. After a few weeks working together, you'd forget they were supposed to be the enemy. One of them, Fritz we called him, knew more about fixing tractors than anyone I'd ever met. Saved me a fortune in repair bills." Within the camps themselves, an extraordinary cultural life flourished. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners were entitled to recreational and intellectual activities. The American authorities not only permitted but actively encouraged such pursuits, seeing them as both a morale booster and a method of reducing escape attempts. Camp commanders facilitated the formation of theatrical groups, orchestras, sports teams, and educational programs. At Camp Hearn, prisoners constructed a theater where they performed both German classics and original works. The camp orchestra, composed of professionally trained musicians who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, gave weekly concerts that guards and officers occasionally attended. Soccer leagues formed in nearly every camp, with inter-compound tournaments becoming major events in camp life. Education became another focus. Many camps established formal schools where prisoners could study everything from languages to engineering. With many university professors and professional educators among the captured soldiers, the quality of instruction was often exceptional. American authorities provided textbooks and materials, even allowing prisoners to take correspondence courses from American universities. Some prisoners earned actual college credits while in captivity, educational advancement that would have been impossible had they remained in combat. Otto Engelhardt, a young infantry soldier captured at Kasserine Pass, later credited his time at Camp Swift with changing his life trajectory. "I arrived barely literate. In the camp school, I learned proper German grammar, basic English, mathematics, and mechanical drawing. After repatriation, these skills allowed me to find work as a draftsman rather than returning to farm labor. My time as a prisoner gave me education I never could have afforded." For the American authorities, this robust intellectual and recreational program served multiple purposes. Beyond meeting Geneva requirements, it reduced disciplinary problems, provided intelligence opportunities through observation, and, perhaps most importantly, laid groundwork for eventual re-education efforts. As the war progressed, American officials increasingly viewed the POW program as an opportunity to expose future German citizens to democratic values before their eventual return home. Not all aspects of camp life were harmonious. Nazi hardliners within the prisoner population often attempted to maintain military discipline and party loyalty among their fellow captives. The American authorities initially followed a policy of non-interference with the internal organization of prisoners, allowing German officers to maintain command over their men. This sometimes enabled Nazi elements to intimidate or terrorize prisoners who expressed anti-Hitler sentiments or who were too cooperative with American authorities. These internal conflicts occasionally turned violent. At Camp Swift, a group of anti-Nazi prisoners had to be segregated for their protection after several were beaten by Nazi loyalists. Similar incidents occurred at other Texas camps, leading American authorities to begin screening and separating prisoners based on political ideology, a process that accelerated after 1944 as the Nazi cause became increasingly desperate. Kurt Wagner, a communist who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht, described the tension. "We were supposedly all on the same side, but the Nazis hated me more than they hated the Americans. At night, they would whisper threats that when Germany won the war, they would make sure I disappeared. The Americans eventually moved me to a different compound when they realized the danger. I owe them my life for that." The issue of escape attempts presents another fascinating aspect of the Texas POW story. Despite conditions that many prisoners found comfortable, the military obligation to attempt escape remained strong, particularly among dedicated Nazi officers. However, the geography of Texas itself proved to be the most effective deterrent. With camps located in remote rural areas, escaped prisoners faced vast distances, harsh climate, unfamiliar terrain, and a civilian population that could easily identify them by appearance and language. Most escape attempts ended within days, with exhausted and dehydrated prisoners either surrendering voluntarily or being captured by local authorities. The few who managed to remain at large for extended periods became the subjects of intense manhunts and newspaper coverage. Perhaps the most ambitious escape occurred at Camp Hearn, where a group of U-boat officers spent months digging a sophisticated tunnel only to emerge outside the fence and realize they had nowhere viable to go. They were recaptured within 48 hours. Former Kriegsmarine officer Wilhelm Bruckner explained the psychological dimension. The physical act of escape was possible with enough planning. The impossibility was in what came after. Where would we go? How would we reach a neutral country from the middle of Texas? We were Europeans lost in an immense foreign continent. Some tried anyway out of duty or boredom, but it was theater more than practical action. The American guards who oversaw these camps represented another complex dimension of the story. Many were older reservists or soldiers deemed unfit for overseas combat, a fact that created an unusual dynamic where some prisoners had more recent combat experience than their captors. Guard duty at POW camps was generally considered less prestigious than overseas service, creating occasional morale issues among the American personnel. Training for POW camp guards emphasized the Geneva Convention and proper treatment protocols. Guards were instructed to be firm but fair, to avoid fraternization while maintaining professional behavior, and to use deadly force only as a last resort. Those who spoke German were particularly valuable as interpreters, but were also monitored to prevent excessive closeness with prisoners. Sergeant Raymond Tucker, who served as a guard at Camp Swift, reflected decades later, "Some of the boys wanted to treat them rough, especially after we started getting news about what happened at Bataan or in the German camps, but our officers were strict about following the rules. They said if we mistreated prisoners, we'd be no better than the Nazis. Besides, most of those prisoners were just ordinary fellows following orders, same as us." As 1944 progressed and Allied forces pushed deeper into Europe, the mood in the Texas camps began to shift. News of German defeats reached the prisoners through permitted newspapers and radio broadcasts. For some, this triggered depression or denial. For others, particularly those with anti-Nazi sentiments, it brought hope for Germany's eventual liberation from Hitler. The American authorities carefully managed information flow, seeing it as part of their broader re-education agenda. The announcement of D-Day created particular tension. Lieutenant Walter Schrader recorded in his journal, "The Americans have made no attempt to hide news of the invasion. It is announced on the camp radio and in the newspapers they provide us. Some men weep openly, believing this is the beginning of Germany's destruction. Others insist it is a deception or that our forces will drive the invaders back into the sea. I remain silent, uncertain what to hope for anymore." The death of President Roosevelt in April 1945 created another remarkable moment in the camps. In several Texas facilities, prisoners who had come to respect the American leader requested permission to hold memorial services. At Camp Hearn, German prisoners crafted a wreath to honor the fallen president, a gesture that confounded some American guards but deeply moved others. Even in captivity, human connections formed across the barriers of conflict. As Germany's military situation deteriorated, American authorities intensified their efforts to identify and segregate Nazi true believers from the general prisoner population. By early 1945, a formal classification system divided prisoners into white, anti-Nazi, gray, politically neutral, and black, pro-Nazi categories, with separate compounds and different privileges. This system sought to prevent intimidation while preparing for the eventual challenge of post-war occupation and denazification. When news of Hitler's suicide and Germany's surrender arrived in May 1945, reactions in the camps ranged from relief to despair. For many prisoners, the collapse of the Nazi regime meant not only the end of the war, but uncertainty about whether they would have homes to return to. As reports of Soviet occupation of eastern Germany and the massive displacement of German civilians began to reach them, Johann Müller, a Wehrmacht infantry sergeant, described the complex emotions. "We received better treatment as defeated enemies in America than we had as German soldiers under our own government. Now our country was destroyed, our future uncertain." Strange as it sounds, the safe routine of the camp had become more comfortable than the chaos we would soon face in returning to a shattered homeland. With the European War's conclusion, the POW program entered a new phase. The Geneva Convention dictated that prisoners should be repatriated as soon as possible after the conclusion of peace. But the complex post-war occupation of Germany and the emerging tensions of what would become the Cold War complicated this process. Many prisoners remained in Texas camps well into 1946, with their labor becoming even more valuable during the immediate post-war agricultural labor shortage. During this extended captivity, American authorities implemented more formal re-education programs aimed at preparing prisoners for return to a democratic Germany. Special courses on democratic institutions, management of free newspapers, and civic responsibility became part of camp life. While participation remained voluntary, many prisoners engaged enthusiastically, seeing such training as valuable for their uncertain futures in occupied Germany. The War Department established a special facility at Fort Eustis, Virginia, where selected German POWs received intensive democratic re-education. Graduates of this program often returned to Texas camps to serve as instructors and facilitators for their fellow prisoners. This initiative, called the Intellectual Diversion Program, later renamed the Democratization Program, represented America's first systematic attempt to rebuild a defeated enemy's civil society through education, a precursor to later Cold War efforts. As 1945 drew to a close, the first significant groups of prisoners began their journey home. The departure was often emotionally complex, with many prisoners expressing gratitude for their treatment, while apprehension about conditions in post-war Germany. Some even attempted to remain in the United States, though official policy required repatriation of all but a few exceptional cases. The journey home proved to be the final surprise in the Texas POW experience. Many prisoners expected to be released directly to civilian status in Germany. Instead, a significant number found themselves transferred to Allied labor battalions in France or Britain, where they worked in reconstruction efforts for months or years before final release. This unexpected extension of captivity created bitterness among some who felt the Americans had betrayed their earlier humane treatment by selling them to European allies as labor. Hans Weber was among those transferred to French control. "The Americans treated us like humans. The French treated us like animals. We cleared minefields with our hands and slept in open fields. It was only then I truly understood how exceptional our treatment in Texas had been. Some of us did not survive this final chapter." Indeed, conditions for German POWs under French control were notoriously harsh, with inadequate food, dangerous work assignments, and primitive housing, a stark contrast to the camps they had left behind in Texas. For those fortunate enough to be repatriated directly to Germany, the return often proved equally jarring. They arrived in a devastated country where food was scarce, infrastructure destroyed, and civilian living conditions far worse than what they had experienced in captivity. Many found their hometowns in ruins or under Soviet occupation, their families displaced or dead. The relative comfort of their American captivity became even more apparent in contrast to post-war German deprivation. Former POW Ernst Kramer wrote in 1947, I returned to find my family surviving on 900 calories per day, living in a partially collapsed building without reliable heat or water. They could not believe my stories of camp orchestras and baseball games, of eggs for breakfast, and cigarettes freely available. They thought captivity had affected my mind. How could I explain that I had been better fed as a prisoner than they were as free citizens in our defeated fatherland? As former prisoners reintegrated into German society, many maintained connections with Texas. Some corresponded with farmers they had worked for or guards they had befriended. A few even managed to emigrate to the United States in the 1950s, settling in the very regions where they had once been held captive. These men often became bridges between cultures, their unique perspective shaped by having seen America first as an enemy, then as a captor, and finally as an adopted home. Former POW Eric Kaminsky, who returned to Texas in 1957 and established a successful bakery in San Antonio, explained, "I saw the real America before most Germans did, not the Hollywood version or the propaganda version, but the everyday reality of American life. I worked alongside Texas farmers, spoke with ordinary Americans, observed how they lived. This gave me an understanding that most of my countrymen lacked. When I had the opportunity to immigrate, I knew exactly where I wanted to go and what to expect." The physical infrastructure of the Texas POW camp system largely disappeared in the decades following the war. Temporary facilities were dismantled, their materials repurposed or sold as surplus. The land returned to agricultural use or was developed for other purposes. Today, few visible remnants of this massive detention system remain. At Camp Hearn, a restoration project has reconstructed portions of the camp as a museum, but most sites are marked only by historical plaques if they are commemorated at all. Yet the human legacy of this unique wartime encounter endured through personal relationships and changed perspectives that influenced post-war German-American relations. The American POW program represented a remarkable adherence to humanitarian principles, even amid total war, a demonstration that American democratic values could withstand the pressures of global conflict. For the German prisoners who experienced this system firsthand, it provided a powerful contrast to Nazi propaganda about American barbarism and materialism. The story of Axis prisoners in Texas remains one of the war's most surprising chapters, a case where enemies became reluctant guests, where captivity offered opportunities unavailable at home, and where humane treatment served both moral and strategic objectives. As tensions rise and the final Allied offensive into Germany begins, we turn to the aftermath and the long-term impact of America's unique approach to enemy prisoners, and the extraordinary stories of men who came to America as enemies, but left with a complex appreciation for the nation that had held them captive. As Allied forces pressed deeper into Germany in early 1945, the population of Texas POW camps swelled to its peak. Over 50,000 prisoners were housed in the state, with major facilities at Camp Hearn, Camp Swift, Fort Bliss, and more than a dozen smaller sites. This massive detention operation had become an integral part of the Texas wartime economy, with prisoners providing critical agricultural labor that helped maintain food production despite the departure of so many American workers to military service. The pending German defeat created complex psychological challenges within the camps. Nazi loyalists faced the collapse of their worldview, while prisoners with less ideological attachment to the regime worried about the practical realities of returning to a devastated homeland. American authorities monitored these tensions closely, increasingly separating prisoners based on political orientation to prevent conflict and to identify those who might be valuable in rebuilding post-war Germany. Dr. Maxwell McKnight, a psychiatrist who evaluated prisoners at several Texas facilities, noted in his reports, "We are witnessing the psychological unraveling of an entire belief system. The most dedicated Nazis are experiencing what can only be described as an existential crisis. Their God has failed them. The less indoctrinated are showing remarkable adaptability, already positioning themselves for survival in post-Hitler Germany. The most fascinating cases are those who have undergone genuine transformation, embracing democratic values, not out of expediency, but from sincere conversion. This ideological sorting became increasingly formalized. By early 1945, American authorities had established a comprehensive screening system that classified prisoners into categories determining their housing, work assignments, and repatriation priority. Category A prisoners, anti-Nazi, received privileges including better work opportunities and consideration for early release or special roles in occupied Germany. Category B, apolitical or moderate, formed the bulk of the prison population. Category C, committed Nazis, faced restrictions and close monitoring. Werner Drexler exemplified the complexity of these classifications. A former U-boat crewman captured in 1943, Drexler cooperated extensively with American intelligence, providing valuable technical information about German submarines. Placed at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, he worked as an informant identifying hardcore Nazis among new arrivals. When his role was discovered by Nazi loyalists, Drexler was brutally murdered by fellow prisoners, a stark reminder of the dangerous divisions within the captive population. His killers were later tried and executed at Fort Leavenworth, the only German POWs to face capital punishment in America. While such extreme violence remained rare, the collapse of the Nazi regime created significant realignments within the prisoner hierarchy. Officers who had enforced Nazi discipline now found their authority undermined as the reality of Germany's defeat became undeniable. New leaders emerged, often men with technical skills or education, who could help fellow prisoners prepare for post-war life. The American authorities encouraged this transition, seeing it as preparation for Germany's eventual democratization. The VE Day announcement on May 8, 1945, marked a pivotal moment in camp life. Radio broadcasts of the German surrender were played throughout the Texas facilities. At Camp Swift, guards reported a strange silence following the news, broken only by scattered weeping. At Camp Hearn, the prisoner orchestra performed a somber Beethoven selection that evening, instead of their usual light entertainment. The psychological impact varied widely. Some prisoners expressed relief that the killing had ended, while others fell into depression over their nation's defeat. Lieutenant Colonel Jenkins, commanding officer at Camp Hearn, described the atmosphere in his monthly report. The mood following surrender announcement defies simple characterization. Among the prisoners, we observe everything from near celebration to profound grief. Many seem simply numb. Guard personnel have been instructed to show neither triumph nor disdain, but to maintain professional distance during this sensitive transition. Several prisoners have approached staff with questions about their futures that we cannot yet answer. The war's end did not mean immediate repatriation. The Geneva Convention required return of prisoners with the least possible delay after the conclusion of peace, but no formal peace treaty had been signed. Furthermore, the logistics of transporting hundreds of thousands of prisoners across the Atlantic were daunting, especially with shipping still prioritized for returning American troops. Many prisoners would remain in Texas for months or even years after Germany's surrender. This extended captivity created a unique transitional period during which American authorities implemented a more explicit re-education program. The War Department had been quietly preparing democratic orientation materials since 1944, initially disguised as intellectual diversions, to avoid violating Geneva Convention prohibitions against political indoctrination of prisoners. With the war's end, these efforts became more overt, offering courses in democratic governance, management of free media, and civic participation. At Camp Hearn, the former prisoner newspaper Die Woche, The Week, transformed into a laboratory for democratic journalism. Previously subject to both German self-censorship and American security review, The publication now operated with increased independence, openly discussing Germany's war crimes and democratic alternatives to totalitarianism. Similar initiatives took place in camps throughout Texas, with American authorities providing materials while increasingly allowing prisoners to direct their own democratic education. Former Wehrmacht officer and history teacher Karl Steinmetz described his involvement. "I had never been a Nazi. I had been drafted like millions of others. Now the Americans offered me the chance to teach my fellow prisoners about democratic traditions, including aspects of German history that had been suppressed under Hitler. We studied the Weimar Constitution, the Revolution of 1848, even American federalism as a potential model for a reconstructed Germany. For the first time, I could teach without fear." The Factory Project, a specialized initiative at Fort Eustis, Virginia, selected anti-Nazi prisoners from Texas and other camps for intensive democratic leadership training. These men, chosen for their education, leadership potential, and democratic leanings, received specialized instruction in democratic institutions, free press operation, labor relations, and civic administration. Upon completion, many returned to Texas camps as instructors, forming the nucleus of what American authorities hoped would become Germany's future democratic leadership. Kurt Wagner, the former political prisoner who had been protected from Nazi harassment by American authorities, described his factory experience. "We lived in open barracks without guard towers or barbed wire. American professors taught us constitutional principles, journalistic ethics, and public administration. We debated freely, something impossible in Germany for 12 years. When I returned to Camp Swift to lead discussion groups, I encountered resistance from Nazi diehards, but many others were hungry for new ideas. They could see the old system had led Germany to catastrophe." This re-education effort represented a remarkable evolution in the purpose of the POW program. What had begun as a security necessity and labor solution had transformed into an ambitious attempt at democratic nation-building, a precursor to America's post-war reconstruction efforts in occupied Germany. While participation remained voluntary, camp authorities created incentives for involvement, including better work assignments, increased privileges, and consideration for early repatriation. Not all prisoners embraced these initiatives. Hardcore Nazis often boycotted re-education programs or attempted to disrupt them. Others participated superficially, seeing democratic rhetoric as expedient without genuinely abandoning their previous beliefs. American intelligence officers conducted ongoing assessment of prisoner attitudes, producing remarkably detailed reports on the ideological climate within each camp and compound. Captain Robert Thompson, an intelligence officer at Camp Swift, noted in his August 1945 evaluation, "Approximately 35% of prisoners show genuine openness to democratic concepts, 45% appear pragmatically accepting, but without ideological commitment, and 20% remain actively or passively resistant." The latter group consists primarily of former SS personnel, Hitler Youth leaders, and career military officers, whose identity is inseparable from the fallen regime. Our greatest success has been among younger prisoners with technical education and those from regions with pre-Nazi democratic traditions. The end of the Pacific War in August 1945 accelerated repatriation planning, as shipping resources could finally be allocated to prisoner return. By September, the first significant groups of Texas POWs began their journey home, primarily anti-Nazi prisoners selected for early release to assist occupation authorities, followed by those with agricultural or technical skills needed for German reconstruction. The selection process remained opaque to most prisoners, creating anxiety and competition for spots on early transport ships. The departure process involved extensive preparation. Prisoners received medical examinations, documentation of their captivity period, and settlement of their camp accounts. Many had accumulated substantial savings from their labor. Each man was permitted to take personal possessions, a new set of clothing, and a small amount of American currency. Some camps provided basic supply packages containing items scarce in post-war Germany: soap, razor blades, chocolate, and cigarettes, commodities that would become valuable trade goods in the devastated German economy. For many prisoners, the prospect of return elicited mixed emotions. Friedrich Miller, who had spent 3 years at Camp Herren, expressed this ambivalence in a final diary entry. "Tomorrow we board trains for the journey home. America has been our prison, yet many of us have never lived better. We return to a Germany that exists now only in memory. Our cities destroyed, our families scattered, our future uncertain. I have learned to grow cotton, speak English, and play baseball. Will any of this matter in the wasteland we are about to enter? The Americans call this liberation, but I cannot help feeling we are being exiled from safety into chaos." This sentiment was not uncommon. Many prisoners had received letters describing dire conditions in post-war Germany: severe food shortages, destroyed housing, occupation challenges, and social disorder. American intelligence reported that some prisoners deliberately violated rules in hopes of delaying their repatriation. A few even attempted to escape, not to return to Germany, but to disappear into American society, a complete reversal of the usual escape motivation. The first returning prisoners encountered conditions that confirmed their worst fears. Richard Albrecht, repatriated to Bremen in October 1945, later wrote to his former camp commander, "The America I left was orderly, prosperous, and functioning. The Germany I returned to scarcely deserves the name of country. People live in cellars beneath rubble that once was their homes. There is no reliable food distribution, no functioning government below the occupation authorities. My family did not recognize me. I was fat and healthy from camp life while they had been starving. The cigarettes and chocolate I brought from Texas secured us an apartment and winter fuel through bartering." The contrast between conditions in Texas camps and post-war Germany created a psychological phenomenon that some military psychiatrists termed reverse captivity shock. Prisoners who had adjusted to the relative comfort and predictability of camp life now faced overwhelming uncertainty in their devastated homeland. Many found themselves longing for aspects of their captivity, even as they celebrated their technical freedom. Not all returning prisoners went directly to civilian life in Germany. Allied occupation authorities faced enormous reconstruction challenges and needed skilled labor. Despite American intentions to repatriate prisoners directly, agreements with France and Britain resulted in the transfer of thousands of former Texas POWs to European work battalions. Under these arrangements, prisoners remained in military custody while performing reconstruction work in French and British zones, often under conditions significantly harsher than they had experienced in America. Werner Schmidt transferred from Camp Swift to a French labor battalion in November 1945, described the stark contrast. "In Texas, we ate white bread and meat daily. In the French camp, we received 1 loaf of black bread for 5 men and soup made from vegetable scraps. In Texas, we had heated barracks and hot showers. Under the French, we slept in tents even in winter and went weeks without bathing. We cleared rubble and disarmed mines by hand. Many died. When we complained, the French guards said, 'Now you know how we lived under your occupation.'" This unexpected extension of captivity created diplomatic tensions. American authorities had assured prisoners of direct repatriation, and reports of harsh treatment in European labor battalions prompted protests from both former prisoners and American officials who had overseen the POW program. By 1947, international pressure led to the release of most transferred prisoners, though some remained in French custody until 1948, 3 years after the war's end. For the majority of Texas POWs who returned directly to civilian status in occupied Germany, reintegration presented different challenges. Many found their professional credentials unrecognized, their former positions eliminated, and their military service now a liability rather than an asset. They entered a society undergoing comprehensive denazification, where past associations could determine employment prospects, housing access, and civic rights. In this environment, their American captivity sometimes proved advantageous. Work certificates from Texas camps documented agricultural or technical skills. Participation in re-education programs suggested political acceptability to occupation authorities. Even their physical health, maintained by American rations, gave them advantages in competing for limited jobs requiring physical labor. Some former prisoners found employment with occupation authorities specifically because of skills or English language proficiency acquired during captivity. Hans Berger, who had worked as a mechanic at Camp Swift, leveraged this experience upon return to Stuttgart. The American motor pool needed mechanics who understood their vehicles. My certificate showing I had maintained American trucks at Camp Swift secured me immediate employment with the occupation forces. Within weeks, I had moved my family from a refugee camp to proper housing, as my position included ration allocations and housing priority. My captivity literally saved us from starvation. The long-term impact of the Texas POW experience manifested in less tangible ways as well. Former prisoners carried unique perspectives on American society that contradicted both Nazi propaganda and post-war Soviet narratives. Many became informal cultural ambassadors, their first-hand experiences providing counterpoints to anti-American sentiment during the emerging Cold War. In countless German households, former POWs could say with authority, "I lived among the Americans, and it was not as you have been told." Heinrich Müller, who spent 2 years at Camp Hearn before returning to Cologne, described this role. When Russian propaganda claimed Americans were exploiting Germans, I could say truthfully that I had been treated with dignity and fair compensation for my labor. When conservatives complained about American cultural influence, I could explain that Americans themselves had diverse views and values. My neighbors trusted my perspective because I had seen America from the inside, not as a tourist or through official channels. This phenomenon extended beyond individual influence. In the critical years of German Reconstruction, thousands of former POWs occupied positions throughout West German society, in agriculture, education, business, and eventually government. Their exposure to American practices and values subtly influenced the development of West German institutions during the crucial formative period of 1945-1955. The democratic re-education that had begun in Texas camps bore fruit in a Germany struggling to rebuild not just its infrastructure, but its civic culture. The post-war testimony of Camp Hearn prisoner Karl Wilhelm Tümler exemplifies this influence. In the camp newspaper, I learned journalistic practices, factual reporting, separation of news from opinion, editorial independence. When I later became editor of a local newspaper in Bavaria, I implemented these principles despite pressure from political interests. The press freedom I first practiced in a prison camp became my professional standard in free Germany. American authorities recognized this potential influence. As Cold War tensions intensified, the U.S. State Department maintained contact with former POW associations, occasionally sponsoring visits by prominent former prisoners who had established successful careers in West Germany. These men served as living refutations of Soviet propaganda, depicting Americans as culturally barbaric and economically exploitative. Their wartime experience in America, even as captives, had given them a perspective that made communist narratives implausible. The political geography of divided Germany created a natural experiment, demonstrating the POW program's impact. Former prisoners repatriated to Soviet-controlled East Germany faced an additional layer of suspicion due to their American exposure. East German authorities viewed them as potentially contaminated by capitalist influences, subjecting many to surveillance, political re-education, or employment restrictions. Despite these pressures, sociological studies conducted after German reunification found that former American POWs in East Germany maintained measurably more positive attitudes toward the United States throughout the Cold War period. Walter Strasser, captured in North Africa and held at Camp Swift before returning to what became East Germany, described this precarious position. I learned to keep quiet about my American experiences. The official line was that American captivity had been exploitative and harsh. My actual memories of adequate food, fair treatment, and work that taught me valuable skills contradicted this narrative. If I spoke honestly, I risked being labeled an American sympathizer. So I remained silent publicly, but shared the truth with family and trusted friends. In private, we knew the system was lying. For American communities that had hosted POW camps, the departure of prisoners marked the end of a unique historical chapter, one that had transformed perceptions on both sides. Initial fears about housing the enemy had largely given way to more nuanced understanding. Farmers who had worked alongside prisoners recognized common humanity across political and national divisions. Some local residents maintained correspondence with former prisoners long after repatriation, creating transnational friendships that spanned the Cold War divide. The economic impact of the POW labor program had been substantial. In Texas alone, prisoners performed millions of man-hours of agricultural work between 1943 and 1946, harvesting cotton, rice, citrus fruits, and vegetables that might otherwise have rotted in fields. The program generated approximately $100 million in total value, equivalent to over $1.5 billion today, with farmers paying prevailing wages to the War Department for prisoner labor. This arrangement served multiple interests. Farmers received essential workers, the government recouped some POW maintenance costs, and prisoners earned income while acquiring agricultural skills. Jesse Williams, whose farm near Navasota employed prisoners from Camp Hearn, reflected on this arrangement decades later. Without those German boys, we'd have lost half our crops. Couldn't get enough regular workers with all the young men overseas. They were good workers, too, disciplined, careful with equipment. Some were farm boys themselves back in Germany and knew more about certain things than we did. Taught us a few tricks about irrigation. Wasn't what anyone expected, enemies helping feed America during wartime, but that's exactly what happened. The departure of this labor force created significant agricultural challenges in 1946-47. Texas farmers who had come to rely on prisoner workers suddenly faced acute shortages as the camps closed. This contributed to the expansion of the Bracero program, bringing Mexican contract laborers to the region, a program that would shape Texas agriculture and demographics for decades to come. The POW labor experience also influenced post-war agricultural mechanization as farmers sought technological solutions to reduce labor dependency. The physical infrastructure of the Texas POW camp system largely disappeared in the post-war years. Built as temporary facilities, most camps were dismantled shortly after the prisoners departed. The War Department sold buildings as surplus, with many structures repurposed as farm buildings, storage facilities, or low-cost housing. Campsites returned to agricultural use or were redeveloped for other purposes. By the 1950s, few visible remnants remained of what had been an extensive detention network housing tens of thousands. This physical erasure contributed to the fading of public memory regarding the POW program. Within a generation, many Texans had little awareness that their communities had once housed enemy prisoners or that German soldiers had harvested crops from local fields. The Cold War's emphasis on Soviet threats overshadowed memories of the preceding conflict, while shifting demographic patterns meant fewer residents had personal connections to the wartime experience. Historian Arnold Kramer, whose pioneering research in the 1970s brought renewed attention to the Texas POW story, described this historical amnesia. I interviewed elderly residents who initially denied any POW camps had existed in their communities, only to later recall detailed interactions with prisoners. It wasn't deliberate forgetting so much as the displacement of these memories by more immediate concerns. The POW chapter simply didn't fit neatly into either wartime heroism narratives or post-war recovery stories, so it fell into a historical blind spot. In Germany, by contrast, the The American POW experience remained vivid in personal and family memories, if not in official historical narratives. Returned prisoners often shared stories of their Texas captivity, creating intergenerational knowledge that survived even as the Cold War reconfigured German-American relations. These personal accounts typically emphasized fair treatment, cultural exchanges, and unexpected opportunities rather than the privations of captivity, a narrative focus that distinguished American imprisonment from the harsher experiences of those held by other Allied powers. Heinz Schmidt, who spent 18 months at Camp Swift before returning to Munich, maintained this family tradition. My grandchildren know more about my time in Texas than about my combat service. I've shown them the chess set I carved in the camp workshop, the English dictionary I studied each night, the photographs of the camp soccer team. These are not stories of suffering, but of an unexpected chapter that changed my understanding of both America and myself. This complexity doesn't fit the simple war narratives, but it is the truth I lived. This complexity extended to the American side as well. Camp guards and administrators who had daily interaction with prisoners often developed perspectives that contradicted wartime propaganda, depicting Germans as uniformly fanatical Nazis. Many recognized the prisoners' diversity, from teenage conscripts to middle-aged reservists, from committed Nazi party members to reluctant draftees, from Prussian aristocrats to working-class laborers. This nuanced understanding sometimes created tension with civilians whose war experience was shaped primarily by media portrayals. Lieutenant Robert Johnson, who served as an administrative officer at Camp Hearn, later described this perspective shift. I entered service seeing the enemy as a monolithic entity, the Germans or the Nazis. Daily interaction with prisoners shattered that perception. I met mathematicians, farmers, musicians, craftsmen, men whose lives had been interrupted by war, just as ours had been. Some remained committed Nazis, certainly, but most were ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. This understanding complicated my view of the conflict without diminishing my commitment to defeating Hitler's regime. By the early 1950s, as Cold War alliances solidified, West Germany's transformation from enemy to NATO ally created new context for the POW experience. Former prisoners now found their American captivity potentially advantageous rather than stigmatizing. Some even leveraged their familiarity with American culture and language to secure positions with U.S. forces stationed in West Germany or with American companies expanding European operations. The relationships formed during captivity occasionally facilitated business connections, educational exchanges, and immigration opportunities. For a small but significant number of former prisoners, the Texas experience proved so influential that they eventually returned to the United States as immigrants. The 1948 Displaced Persons Act and subsequent immigration reforms provided pathways for former enemies to become American residents and eventually citizens. While exact numbers are difficult to establish, historical records indicate that several hundred former German POWs held in Texas later immigrated to the United States, often settling in the same regions where they had been imprisoned. Eric Kaminsky, the former POW who established a bakery in San Antonio after immigrating in 1957, explained this seemingly paradoxical choice. People ask why I would return to the country that imprisoned me. They don't understand that my captivity showed me the best of America, not the worst. I saw opportunity, fairness, and openness to newcomers, even former enemies. Where else could a man who once fought against a nation later build a successful business there? This transformation from enemy to neighbor represents what I most admire about America. As these former prisoners integrated into American communities, they brought unique perspectives on both their homeland and their adopted country. Many became active in German-American cultural organizations, church communities, and business associations. Their children, raised with dual cultural influences, often maintained connections to German heritage while fully embracing American identity. This integration represented a remarkable postscript to the POW experience, former enemies becoming part of the American national fabric. The children and grandchildren of these immigrant former POWs inherited complex narratives about war, captivity, and reconciliation. Daniel Weber, whose grandfather had been held at Camp Swift before immigrating to Texas in the 1950s, described this legacy. My grandfather's stories weren't typical war stories of heroism or suffering. They were about playing soccer in the Texas heat, learning English from guard interactions, working in cotton fields alongside Mexican laborers. He taught me that enemies don't remain enemies forever, that people are more than their governments or uniforms. This perspective shaped my understanding of both family history and international relations. For those who remained in Germany, the Texas experience often retained an almost mythic quality, a strange interlude of relative comfort amid a catastrophic war. As Germany rebuilt and eventually prospered, the material conditions in POW camps no longer seemed remarkable, but the psychological aspect, humane treatment by an enemy nation, continued to resonate. This memory contributed to the generally positive German attitudes toward the United States during the crucial early decades of the Cold War, providing personal counterweight to Soviet anti-American propaganda. The humanitarian principles that guided the American POW program yielded long-term strategic benefits that military planners could hardly have anticipated. By treating prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards, and often exceeding those standards, the United States created thousands of informal ambassadors who carried first-hand knowledge of American society back to post-war Germany. This soft power influence operated at individual and community levels, shaping attitudes during Germany's critical democratic transition. In the broader historical context, the Texas POW story represents a rare instance where adherence to humanitarian principles aligned perfectly with strategic national interests. The program successfully removed enemy combatants from the battlefield, extracted economic value through labor, gathered intelligence, influenced post-war German development, and enhanced America's international reputation, all while maintaining the moral high ground through humane treatment. This multifaceted success offers enduring lessons about the practical value of ethical conduct even amid the extreme pressures of total war. The scholarly rediscovery of the POW story began in the 1970s as historians like Arnold Kramer conducted extensive interviews with aging former prisoners and camp personnel. These oral histories preserved first-hand accounts that might otherwise have been lost, revealing dimensions of the wartime experience absent from official records. Archaeological investigations at former campsites have subsequently uncovered physical artifacts, handcrafted items, modified facilities, and personal possessions that provide material evidence of prisoner life. At Camp Hearn, a restoration and museum project has reconstructed portions of the original facility, creating a tangible link to this nearly forgotten chapter of Texas history. Similar preservation efforts at other former camp sites have established historical markers, interpretive centers, and educational programs that integrate the POW experience into broader narratives of World War II. These initiatives recognize that understanding the complexity of wartime history requires examining not just combat operations, but the diverse experiences of all participants, including those behind barbed wire. The Texas POW experience reveals paradoxes that challenge simplified narratives of World War II. Enemy soldiers received humane, sometimes comfortable treatment, while Americans endured rationing and combat casualties. Agricultural communities developed working relationships with the same foreign forces their sons were fighting overseas. A prison system designed for security and containment evolved into an ambitious experiment in democratic re-education. These contradictions reflect the war's complexity better than more straightforward narratives of heroism and villainy. For the prisoners themselves, the lasting impact was often deeply personal. Many describe their time in Texas as transformative, not through coercion or indoctrination, but through exposure to alternatives to totalitarianism. They observed a society that, despite wartime pressures and its own imperfections, maintained commitment to individual rights, democratic processes, and rule of law. This lived experience proved more persuasive than any propaganda, influencing their post-war choices and attitudes. Kurt Meyer, captured in Normandy and held at Camp Swift until 1946, summarized this transformation. "I arrived in Texas a product of the Hitler Youth, convinced of German superiority and America's decadence. I departed understanding that strength comes not from uniformity but from diversity, not from blind obedience but from individual initiative within a framework of law. This understanding didn't come from lectures or force, but from observation and interaction. The Americans didn't need to indoctrinate us because their system's advantages were self-evident when experienced directly. As the last generation with direct memory of World War II passes, the preservation of complex wartime experiences like the POW program becomes increasingly important. These stories complicate triumphalist narratives without diminishing the moral clarity of the Allied cause. They demonstrate that even in history's clearest moral conflicts, human experiences rarely align neatly with national boundaries or ideological divisions. They remind us that humanity persists even among battlefield enemies, and that reconciliation becomes possible when this shared humanity is recognized. The story of Axis prisoners in Texas illuminates a remarkable moment when enemies became guests, when captivity offered unexpected opportunities, and when humane treatment served both ethical and strategic purposes. As former Wehrmacht officer Carl Schmitt wrote in his 1980 memoir, "In Texas, behind barbed wire, I experienced what now seems a historical impossibility, being simultaneously a German soldier, a prisoner of war, and a beneficiary of American generosity. This contradiction taught me that human history is never as simple as ideologies claim. Nations may be enemies, but humans need not be. This lesson has been the most valuable souvenir of my strange American journey."